first synthesizer for me has been the one installed in this music research center in Paris, where they had the big studio where they had a bunch of oscillators and remodulators and envelopes. And it has been conceived probably in the late 40s. This bank of oscillators, not really named as synthesizer, was actually a synthesizer with all what we have these days in an analog monophonic synthesizer. The first work I've done with pure electronic instruments have been with this one, with this environment. Actually, we had to steal the keys of the studio because we were not allowed to touch it. The first recording I did it at night by just practicing things I was discovering. And then my first synthesizer has been the VCS3, the Putney VCS3 from EMS, which is still probably one of my top 5 favorite synthesizers of all time. I've been really interested by it because you had no other ones in France. It was not existing even in France, it was just in London. And you had to go to the guy, Peter Zinoviev, I mean, the guy who created it, to see it and to have a demo. I remember that, and that was a very good sign. I sold my guitar and my amplifier. I went to London and to purchase the EMS VCS3. So it was really for me a kind of shift between the definite rock sound and into electronic music. It's a real modular synthesizer, but with pins instead of cables. And I must say that all my early work with a synthesizer have been done with this. You can really make crazy sounds quite easily with it. And all the sounds of oxygen, for instance, apart from the pads and all these bubbly kind of effects and all that are all coming from the VCS3. Since then, I really used it in all of my projects because I love this thing so much. And it has that kind of Proustian, nostalgic type of relationship I have. It's like an old friend. When I'm looking back, what I perceive is I've been also depending on the evolution of synthesis and synthesizers in my life. I mean, starting with the first synthesizer, I had the EMS VCS3, then moving to the R2600, and they were monophonic instruments. And when suddenly the first polyphonic instrument arrived, I mean, synthesizer arrived, it was like, a miracle. And the first one I used was probably the Jupiter 8 from Roland, and the Memory Moog, which for me is a kind of Rolls-Royce of polyphonic analog synthesizer, and the Syntex from Elka could be the Bentley of polyphonic synthesizer. And then this period of the late 80s, beginning of the 90s was quite dark in terms of pure synthesis, because the digital instruments were not evolved enough and the analog instruments were not existing anymore. So you had a kind of strange moment there. The American philosophy of synthesizer, like the ARP, the Moog, sequential circuits, moving to the Japanese Yamaha type of things, I mean, changed the way we were approaching working on synthetic sounds. We started much more to use presets and to transform and to process presets than creating sounds from scratch. I started to use plugins probably when I started using Pro Tools, more for all processing sound than creating sounds. I mean, in other words, I used plugins first more for compressors and delays and EQs than for generating sounds. That came later on. And if I think of it, I think that it came with probably with native instruments, that suddenly synthesizers in the plugin format started to have a kind of credibility for me. I remember a while ago when the Monarch has been released, somebody at Native gave me a call and saying, I know that you have different Mini Moog and we would be very curious to hear what you think about the Monarch, because we think that it's very close and probably much closer to any other Mini Moog versions. I remember I was in London and in a studio in London, and I spent a few hours to do tests, and I was really amazed because it's very, very close. I mean, I would even say for me that the Monarch is better for me than the new hardware Moog synthesizer. I'm saying this because I don't care. I'm not endorsed by anyone, so I'm just saying as a musician, I prefer working on the Monarch than on the Voyager these days. Now, developers are understanding that you have to add some kind of random elements. The beautiful work that Native Instruments has achieved with the Monarch, for instance, is to create these kind of random artifacts that you have in the analog processing. What I think is there is a kind of obsession for lots of developers to try to create a plug-in version of existing analog synthesizers. But I think the real excitement is to propose new concepts. I mean, if you take Massive, for instance, it's something that was not existing in the hardware previously. Just one plugin created a new genre of music like the dubstep, for instance. And this has nothing to do with revisiting an existing instrument. It's a new concept. And it's what I like, because it's time now that developers could think like these guys in the old days. I mean, when Moog started to do modular Moog, he was not trying to replicate some existing concept for a very good reason, because there were none. And it's the same thing today. You couldn't do the sounds you can do with Massive or with Razor with anything else. Sometimes I use, for instance, Massive or Razor in totally different way, just by doing strange pads behind something that I already recorded. And just to add one layer, it's very subtle, but I mean, it's funny to talk about Massive, for instance, saying that it can be subtle, because Massive got the reputation by being extreme with dubstep and with people such as Skrillex sound and all that kind of things. But for instance, sometimes Massive, I'm using it just in a very subtle way, just to create some depth, like in a movie when you are putting a light at 50 meters from the actors, just to give some different perspective. For my new album, it has been a very interesting project on lots of aspects. I mean, collaborating with different generations of people, covering the 5 decades, almost 4 or 5 decades of electronic music, but also covering different generations and decades of electronic instruments. And I would say that one of the best examples is the track called Close Your Eyes that I've done with Air. And we went with this idea that it could be fun to start the piece of music with the instruments of the beginning of the history of electronic music, and then all along the track, I mean, using the different generations and families of instruments, then starting by the tape recorder and loops and sounds from the 50s and the 60s, and then ending with plugins, and in between using modular Moogs and polyphonic and digital synthesizers and all that. I started the process by actually doing the first intro with some oscillators that I found in Berlin, in Paris, and also doing the beat with calculating the tempo with the speed of the tape. For instance, if you are in 120, it takes 2 seconds. 2 seconds by, I mean, if you take 15 inches per second, so the half for 1 bar, it will be 7.5 inch. And if you want the 8th note or 16th note, you have to divide with your meter by centimeters and editing the loop like this. And then I faded in it to a mini pop drum machine that was creating the beats for the rest of the song. And I finished by using the FM8 and the Massive and also the Monarch. And in between, using the ARP2600 and the Moog. They used also the vocoder for recording Air. We used the Fairlight. We used the emulator. I mean, we covered more or less all the range of the electronic music instruments history in one track. It has been like an initiation journey for me. I mean, confronting my own habits in music with such great artists, from Tangerine Dream to Kessa Feldstein to Fog Buttons and Moby and Air, Massive Attack and John Carpenter, lots of different artists. And for every artist, there is a reason why, there is a link. I have to say this even if you are going to cut it on the editing, but I'm going to say it anyway. I started this process with using Pro Tools and analog synthesizers a lot, and I ended it using Live Ableton and Native Instruments plugins. The more I went into the process of the final production of the project, the more I use plugins, the more I use those, and the less I'm using, for instance, my SSL here. With lots of respect with this kind of instrument, it doesn't fit the way I approaching sounds and music these days. It shows a lot in the way what this project is all about, covering different genres in electronic music, but also through this process, I really changed my mind and my approach to electronic music itself, to how to use instruments in 2015, 2016, and also in a way to record this. I almost changed all my habits from A to Z. You have to find every occasion and every opportunity to break your habits, to keep the freshness. The evolution of technology keeps me fresh.